The chamber was enormous. It was the kind of place that made even the oldest and proudest beings feel small. The walls curved upward like the inside of a shell, and the ceiling was so high that the light at the top looked like distant stars. Hundreds of seats were arranged in wide, sweeping rows, and in those seats sat the representatives of 31 species, beings with 4 arms, beings with no eyes, beings that breathed through gills and floated inside sealed water tanks, beings covered in scales or feathers or hard shells of bone. This was the Galactic Council, the oldest governing body in the known universe, and it had been meeting in this chamber for over 6,000 years. The Vreth fleet moved through the corridor of space known on human charts as the Veil Approach. It was a long stretch of territory, about 3 light hours across, that sat between the border and the first major human colony, a planet called Harrow's Gate. On Vreth charts, it was simply marked as empty space. On the Council's navigation maps, it was listed as a low-density asteroid zone. Nothing important, nothing strategic, just rocks and dust and the quiet dark between the stars. Krethax had looked at this corridor and seen a highway, a clear road straight into the heart of human space. His fleet could move through it at full speed, arrive at Harrow's Gate in less than 2 days, take the colony, and use it as a base for the rest of the campaign. His admirals had agreed. His analysts had confirmed it. The corridor was empty. There was nothing there. 312 ships were sent through first, a vanguard force, the tip of the spear. The rest of the fleet held position at the entrance to the corridor and waited. This was standard Vreth doctrine. Send the forward force through, secure the path, signal the all clear, then advance the main fleet. It had worked in every major Vreth campaign for the past 100 years. It was so reliable that Krethax didn't even watch the feed personally. He left it to his junior officers and went to his planning room to review the schedule for the next phase of the campaign. He was looking at a star map when the screaming started. Not screaming from the humans, screaming from his own officers. He ran back to the command deck. The screens were full of chaos. The forward vanguard, the 312 ships he had sent through the corridor, was gone from the sensor grid. Not retreating, not damaged, gone. 211 ships had been destroyed in 11 minutes. The remaining 100 were dark, no power, no engines, no response. Krethax stared at the screens. His jaw was tight. His amber eyes moved from one display to the next, trying to understand what he was seeing. "Report," he said. His voice was very quiet. His sensor officer, a young Vreth with shaking hands, pulled up the recorded feed. "The asteroid's commander," she said. "They moved." Krethax looked at the playback. He watched it twice. Then he watched it a third time and still could not fully accept what he was seeing. The asteroids in the corridor had moved. Not drifted, not shifted by some gravitational anomaly. Moved. Deliberately. In coordinated directions. Hundreds of them, each one ranging from the size of a small building to the size of a city block, all accelerating at once from multiple directions, closing in on the vanguard fleet like a net pulling tight. The first collisions happened so fast that the Vreth ships had no time to raise full shields. Hull breaches opened across dozens of vessels in seconds. Ships trying to maneuver collided with each other as they dodged the rocks. Engines were crushed. Power cores went critical. And then the asteroids that didn't hit directly began to explode, not from natural causes, but from shaped charges buried inside them, charges that had been set at specific angles to send shrapnel exactly where it would do the most damage. It was not a meteor field. It had never been a meteor field. It was a weapon. The humans had spent 3 days attaching ion drives to asteroids. Small ones, drives the size of a cargo container, bolted to the surface and remote activated. They had mapped the corridor's asteroid positions, calculated the trajectories, pre-programmed every drive, and then gone quiet. They hadn't moved their ships away because they were retreating. They had moved their ships away to make room, to clear the kill zone before they closed the trap. Krethax stood on his command deck and said nothing for a very long time. In the Galactic Council chamber, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The live feed had been running the whole time, but most representatives had been watching with the relaxed attention of beings who expected nothing interesting to happen. Several had left to get food. 2 were having a quiet conversation in a side corridor. Overseer Plune had been writing notes about trade route adjustments for the post-war period. Then the Vanguard feed erupted in fire and rock and collapsing ship hulls, and every being in the council chamber went completely still. Someone dropped a ceremonial data tablet. It hit the floor with a sharp crack and nobody looked at it. Plune's eyes went white, the collective color for shock so deep it short-circuited all other emotional responses. Cyril did not move. He sat in his chair and watched the playback that the council analysts were already running at a slower speed, pointing out the moment the first asteroid drive activated, the moment the trap sealed, the moment 200 ships ceased to exist as functional vessels. His 4 arms were still folded across his chest. His silver eyes were very calm, but inside them was something that had not been there an hour ago. Attention, real attention, the kind he had not given to a conflict in a very long time. "They moved the rocks," said a representative from the Hessen Consortium, a tall, thin being with feathery antennae that were now standing fully upright. "They physically moved the rocks. How long would that take?" 3 days, said one of the council analysts already pulling data. Possibly 4 if they were being careful about masking the thermal signatures of the drives. The asteroids were pre-positioned, and the analyst paused, reading something that had just come through. And the charges were custom fabricated. They weren't pulling from a weapon stockpile. They built the charges specifically for this corridor. "They built a weapon out of a rock field," the Hessen representative said. He said it very slowly, like he was checking the words to make sure they were real. "They built a weapon out of this specific rock field," Cyril corrected. "They studied the corridor first. They knew which asteroids to use, where to position the drives, what yield of charge would be needed for effective hull penetration at those ship speeds. This was not improvised. This was planned." The chamber was quiet again for a moment. "Before the war started?" Plune asked. Cyril looked at him. "Yes," he said, "long before." On the feed, the Vreth main fleet had stopped moving. They were holding position at the corridor entrance, surrounded by the wreckage of their forward force drifting back toward them in pieces. Krethax's flagship was visible on the long-range sensors, a massive vessel, heavily armored, painted with the gold and black markings of the Dominion's highest command rank. It was not moving. The whole fleet was simply stopped. One of the council analysts said quietly, "The Vreth have been in this corridor before. Survey missions, trade route explorations. They've passed through it at least 6 times in the last decade. The humans had access to those transit logs through standard council shipping records. They knew the Vreth had mapped this corridor. They knew the Vreth would use it." Another silence fell across the chamber. "They wanted them to use it," someone said from the back. Nobody disagreed. Cyril looked down at his personal screen. He pulled up the council analyst report he had read twice before, the one with the 4% probability of human victory. He read it again, but this time it seemed to him like a document written about a completely different situation, like someone had given him a weather report for the wrong planet. He set the screen down and looked back at the main feed. The Vreth fleet was still not moving. Krethax was clearly assessing, pulling back sensors, trying to understand the full scope of what had just happened to him. This was the right thing to do. Cyril recognized good military instinct when he saw it. Krethax was not panicking. He was thinking. But the thinking was going to take time. And time, Cyril was beginning to understand, was something the Vreth did not have as much of as they believed. The humans had a diplomatic channel open the entire time. It had been open since before the invasion began, a standard council-mediated line, meant to allow for last-minute negotiation or ceasefire requests. The humans had not used it to beg. They had not used it to threaten. They had used it to talk, in a slow and methodical way, about technical details of a possible ceasefire framework, about which colonial administrators would need to be involved in any settlement, about transport logistics for civilian populations. Cyril had assumed this was desperation diplomacy, a species trying to slow the advance by keeping a conversation going. He understood now that it was something else. The humans were talking about things that didn't matter because they were keeping the Vreth diplomatic team occupied, busy, watching a conversation instead of watching the clock, buying hours, hours that had been used to arm asteroids, to position ships, to prepare the second phase of something that apparently had a second phase. A junior council analyst raised her hand nervously and said, "Ambassador, we're detecting movement from the human fleet." Cyril looked at the secondary screen. She was right. The human ships, which had scattered in what everyone had assumed was panicked retreat, were moving again. But they were not moving toward the Vreth. They were moving into new positions, spreading out along a wide arc around the Vreth fleet's flanks, like hands closing slowly around something. "They're not retreating," Plune said. His voice was very small. His eyes had gone a pale, uncertain blue. "No," Cyril said, "they never were." He leaned forward in his chair, something he had not done in years, something he had not felt the need to do in years. The chamber around him was buzzing now with voices, with questions, with arguments between analysts and representatives about what they were seeing and what it meant. Cyril did not join the conversation. He just watched the screen. He watched the human ships move with slow, careful precision into positions that the Vreth, busy analyzing the asteroid ambush and managing their losses, had not yet noticed. He watched the diplomatic channel where a human official was calmly discussing, in complete seriousness, the carbon content regulations for mineral extraction in the outer reach colonies, as if the war happening around them was a minor inconvenience rather than an existential conflict. He looked at the timestamp in the corner of the feed. It had been 1 hour since the invasion began. 1 hour, and already the shape of this war looked nothing like any war he had seen before. Already the numbers in the analyst report felt like fiction. Already Cyril was sitting forward in his chair and paying attention in a way he had not done in a very long time. He thought about what Okonkwo had said when she stood up in this chamber. 3 words, simple words, words that at the time had seemed almost dismissive, the words of a species that didn't understand the gravity of what it was facing. "We'll handle it." He had thought she was being brave. He had thought she was performing a kind of dignity in the face of inevitable defeat. He was beginning to think she had been telling the truth. Today the chamber was loud. Every representative was speaking at once in their own language, through translation chips embedded in the walls. The sound was a low, rolling hum of dozens of voices overlapping, rising and falling like waves. But underneath all of it, one word kept appearing in every language, again and again. "War." Ambassador Cyril of the Thavine sat near the front of the chamber. He was old, older than most beings in the room had any frame of reference for. His species lived for nearly 3,000 years, and he had spent most of his life watching the galaxy tear itself apart and stitch itself back together. He had 4 arms, all folded now across his chest. His eyes, which were a pale silver color, moved slowly across the room. He had seen 22 interstellar wars in his lifetime. He knew what they looked like at the beginning. He knew the shape of them, the feeling in the air, the way certain beings puffed up with confidence while others sank into quiet dread. He had seen this before, many times. A large screen at the front of the chamber lit up. On it appeared the face of Krethax, the unyielding, grand commander of the Vreth Dominion. The Vreth were reptilian, tall, broad, covered in dark green scales that caught the light like polished stone. Krethax was the largest of his kind that most in the chamber had ever seen. His jaw was wide, and his eyes were a deep amber color, flat and cold. He wore battle armor that had been painted with the markings of 40 confirmed military victories. His voice was low and slow. He did not shout, he did not need to. The human colonies known as the Outer Reach, he said, have been placed under the territorial claim of the Vreth Dominion. This claim was submitted to the Galactic Council 14 months ago. It has not been honored. The humans have refused to withdraw. They have refused to negotiate. They have refused to recognize the lawful expansion of the Dominion into unclaimed frontier space. He paused. His amber eyes looked directly into the camera. As of this moment, the Vreth Dominion declares a state of war against the human species. They will leave the Outer Reach, or they will be removed. There will be no further discussion. The broadcast ended. The screen went dark. For a moment the chamber was completely silent. Then the noise came back, louder than before. Representatives stood up. Some were frightened. Some were calculating. Some were already thinking about which side to support, which trade routes would be affected, which resources might become available if the humans lost. Sierval did not stand. He sat still and watched the room. He was not worried, not truly. He had run the numbers himself quietly over the past several weeks, once it became clear that this confrontation was coming. The Vreth Dominion controlled 42 star systems. They had a standing fleet of 1,400 warships, many of them built over the past century specifically for large-scale planetary assault. Their soldiers were experienced. Their commanders were disciplined. Their supply lines were well established and had been tested in 4 major conflicts over the past 2 centuries. The humans, by contrast, controlled 11 star systems. Their fleet numbered somewhere between 400 and 500 ships, depending on which intelligence report one chose to believe. They had fought border skirmishes, small things, pirates mostly, a brief confrontation with the Drekkai near the edge of the Vast Nebula, which had ended in a ceasefire after 6 months. Nothing that resembled a real war, nothing that came close to the scale of what the Vreth were capable of. The Council's own analysts had already submitted their projections. The report was sitting on Sierval's personal data screen right now. He had read it twice. Estimated duration of conflict, 8 to 12 years. Estimated human capitulation point, 2 to 3 years. Probability of human victory, less than 4%. Sierval thought those numbers were generous. A younger representative, Overseer Plune of the Collective, a round-bodied being with 12 fingers and eyes that changed color with his mood, currently a nervous yellow, leaned over towards Sierval from the adjacent seat. "Should we intervene?" Plune asked. His voice was quiet, but his yellow eyes flickered with genuine concern. A full Vreth campaign against a smaller species, it could destabilize the whole frontier. "It won't last long enough to destabilize anything," Sierval said. His voice was calm, even kind. "The Vreth will push in. The humans will hold for a year, perhaps 2. Then the colonies will fall and a settlement will be reached. The humans are young. They are clever in small ways, but they have never fought a real war. Not like this." Plune's eyes shifted to orange, somewhere between relieved and uncertain. "You sound very sure." "I am very sure," Sierval said. "I have seen this pattern 22 times. A smaller species, a larger empire, a resource dispute. It always ends the same way." Plune nodded slowly and turned back to the front of the chamber, where the Council's head administrator was calling for order. On the other side of the chamber, in a seat that was set slightly apart from the others, sat the human ambassador. Her name was Director Yale Okonkwo. She was a tall woman, dark-skinned, with short gray hair and eyes that were very dark brown, almost black. She wore a plain gray uniform with no decorations on it. She had been sitting quietly throughout the entire broadcast, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, her expression giving nothing away. When the administrator called for representatives to respond to the Vreth Declaration, several beings raised their hands or signaled in whatever way their species used to indicate they wished to speak. Sierval expected Okonkwo to be one of them. He expected her to protest, or appeal, or ask the Council to intervene on humanity's behalf. That was what smaller species did when the larger ones came for them. They asked for help. They argued for fairness. They made speeches about rights and sovereignty and galactic law. Okonkwo did not raise her hand. Krethax was not a fool. That was the thing that needed to be understood about him. He had not won 40 campaigns by being careless or arrogant. He had won them because he was adaptable, because he could look at a bad situation and find a way through it without losing his composure. Because he had been trained since childhood to understand that war was not a clean thing, that surprises happened, and that a commander who could not absorb a surprise and keep moving was not a commander at all. He looked at his losses: 211 ships destroyed, 100 more dark, floating, waiting to be recovered if the situation allowed, a third of his forward strength gone in 11 minutes. Any other commander in Vreth history would have called that a disaster. Krethax called it expensive information. He now knew 3 things. He knew the humans had planned this before the war started. He knew they were willing to sacrifice territory, let him walk into their space, in order to control where he went and what he walked into. And he knew that the empty space ahead of him was not empty. It was a canvas on which the humans had been very busy painting things he couldn't yet see. He pulled his fleet back from the corridor entrance and ordered a full sensor sweep. He called his senior admirals together. He told them to forget everything they thought they knew about this campaign and think only about what the enemy had shown them so far. They planned ahead, he said. That means they have more plans. We find the plans before we move. His admirals were good at their work. They spent 40 minutes scanning, mapping, analyzing. They found nothing. No unusual thermal signatures, no hidden fleets, no additional asteroid traps. The space ahead of them looked genuinely clear. Krethax made his decision. He would not use a single path. He would spread the fleet out across a wide front, hundreds of ships advancing in parallel, no single point of vulnerability, too many angles for any hidden trap to cover at once. He formed his ships into what was called a wedge formation, a tactic that had been refined over centuries of Vreth military history. It was the most reliable formation in the Dominion's arsenal. A wide, spreading advance that was nearly impossible to ambush because it had no single corridor to trap, no single point to hit. It had ended 14 wars. It had never failed. He gave the order. The fleet began to move. In the council chamber, the analysts recognized the formation immediately. Vreth Grand Wedge, one of them said, pulling up a historical file. It was used at the Battle of Orin's Gate, the Siege of Vel Primus, the expansion wars of 2109. It works by eliminating choke points. The humans can't repeat the asteroid tactic against a spread formation. There's no single corridor to fill. Several representatives nodded. This made sense to them. The Vreth were adapting. The war was returning to its expected shape. Sirval said nothing. He was watching the human ships on the secondary screen. They had stopped spreading out. They had gone still, all of them, just sitting in their new positions, holding, not moving, waiting. He did not think they were waiting because they had run out of ideas. He thought they were waiting because the Vreth were doing exactly what they expected. On the diplomatic channel, a human official was still talking. He was now explaining, in great detail, the geological survey rights attached to 3 specific asteroids in the outer reach. The Vreth diplomatic team was still engaged, responding, debating small technical points. They had no idea that what they were doing was exactly what they had been meant to do. The Vreth fleet completed its formation and began advancing. Then the drones appeared. They came from everywhere at once, not from a single direction, not from a visible ship. From space itself, it seemed, from positions that were too small and too cold for the Vreth sensors to have detected. Thousands of them, each one no bigger than a large crate. They had no weapons that the Vreth sensors could identify. They were just small metal objects, drifting in from every direction across the wide advance of the fleet, threading through the gaps between ships, moving in patterns that looked almost random. They were not random. Every single drone had been pre-programmed with the hull frequency signatures of Vreth warship fuel junctions. Not the engines, not the bridge, not the weapons systems. The fuel junctions, specific connector points deep inside Vreth ship architecture where pressurized fuel lines met the distribution manifolds. It was a vulnerability that appeared nowhere in any Vreth technical document, nowhere in any engineering file available through Galactic trade records. It was a vulnerability that had been discovered through years of quiet intelligence work. A defector, perhaps, or a captured wreck studied in secret, or simply a brilliant human engineer who had spent a long time thinking about how a Vreth ship worked and where it would hurt the most. The drones didn't need to carry large charges. Just a shaped directional explosive the size of a fist, detonated at the right point on the hull at the right angle, was enough to rupture the junction and trigger a cascade failure through the fuel distribution system. Not an explosion, a shutdown. The ship went dark, engines, weapons, life support on backup only, crew alive but completely stranded. The Council feed showed the results in a terrible, quiet sequence. One ship went dark, then another, then 5 more, then 30. Then they started going dark so fast that the analysts stopped trying to count individual ships and started tracking the total number instead. The Vreth fleet's wide formation, which had been designed to prevent a single point of attack, turned out to be perfect for the drones. The spread-out ships couldn't protect each other. There was too much space between them, too many gaps, too many angles of approach. 340 ships went dark in just over 40 minutes. The council chamber had gone from noise to silence so completely that Searville could hear the ambient hum of the life support systems in the walls. Ploon's eyes were white again. They had been white off and on for the past 2 hours. They knew, said the representative from the Hessen Consortium. He had not moved from his seat in a long time. They knew about the fuel junctions. How did they know about the fuel junctions? That's internal Vreth engineering. That's not public information. It hasn't been public for 200 years, a council analyst confirmed. Her voice was careful and quiet. The Vreth redesigned their fuel systems after the last major conflict and classified all technical documentation. The new junction design has never been published in any standard engineering database. Then how? The analyst looked uncomfortable. We don't know, but the targeting precision of those drones suggests they had exact specifications. Not guesses, specifications. Searville turned the thought over in his mind. If the humans had the technical specifications for classified Vreth engineering, they had been preparing for this conflict for a very long time, not reacting to the Vreth's territorial claim 14 months ago. Not even preparing for the past few years. They had been preparing for a long time, collecting information, studying their potential enemy, quietly building a picture of exactly how the Vreth fought, exactly where they were vulnerable, exactly what would work when the moment came. They had let the war be declared. They had stood up in this chamber and said 3 words, and they had gone back to a plan they had already finished writing. Overseer Ploon leaned close to Searville and said, very quietly, "Do you think they knew this was coming, before the Vreth even made the territorial claim?" Searville thought about it honestly. "I think," he said slowly, "that they have been watching the Vreth expand for a long time. I think they identified the outer reach as a likely flashpoint years ago. And I think they spent that time getting ready, quietly, without filing any reports with this council, without broadcasting any military exercises, without doing anything that would give the Vreth a reason to accelerate their timeline." He paused. They didn't provoke, they didn't warn, they just prepared. Ploon absorbed this. His eyes had shifted to a deep, unsettled green. "That's very cold." "That's very patient," Searville said. "Those are not the same thing." On the primary feed, Krethax had now gone silent. His flagship was still there, still registering on sensors, but the communications channel had gone quiet. He was clearly dealing with something difficult. His fleet had just lost a third of its remaining strength, not to an ambush, not to a single devastating trick, but to something that had been inserted into every gap in his formation simultaneously. Something that had found a weakness he didn't know he had, and exploited it with calm, mechanical precision. What made it worse, and Sierval could see this in the way the Vreth fleet was moving, the small, uncertain adjustments of ships that didn't know what to do, was that it didn't feel like a battle. It felt like a procedure. The drones had not been fired in anger. They had not come screaming in on attack vectors. They had simply drifted in and done their work quietly, efficiently, like a maintenance crew fixing something that needed fixing. It was possibly the most unsettling thing Sierval had ever watched in 60 years of observing wars. And still the diplomatic channel was running. The human official was now discussing, with great seriousness and apparent genuine interest, the water rights agreements for colony settlements in frontier systems. He had been talking for over 2 hours. The Vreth diplomatic team was exhausted and slightly confused and still engaged, still responding, because to stop responding would be to formally break off negotiations, and the Vreth High Command had not yet given that order. Nobody on the Vreth side seemed to have noticed that every time they stayed in the conversation, they were being kept from focusing on something else. "They're still talking," said the Hessian representative, noticing the diplomatic feed for the first time in a while. "They never stop talking," Sierval said. "That's the point." He looked at the timestamp, 2 hours and 53 minutes since the invasion began. The Vreth had lost a staggering fraction of their armada. They had not taken a single colony. They had not landed a single soldier. Their formation advantage was gone. Their tactical surprise was gone. Their confidence, that slow, deep, ancient confidence that came from being an empire that had fought and won for centuries, was, Sierval suspected, very badly shaken. And the humans had not yet committed their main fleet. That was the thing that sat quietly in the back of Sierval's mind and would not leave. All of this, the asteroids, the drones, the diplomatic misdirection, had been done without the primary human battle fleet. He had seen the human ships take positions on the flanks, but they had not fired a single weapon. They had watched. They had held. They were still holding. The main fleet was somewhere else, waiting for something. Sierval looked at the star map. He looked at the positions of the remaining Vreth ships. He looked at the direction the Vreth fleet had been slowly, almost unconsciously, drifting in, pushed by the positions of the drone strikes, guided by the blocking positions of the flanking human ships, channeled by the closed corridor behind them. He traced the direction with one finger. It pointed directly toward Sol. Toward Earth. Sierval sat back in his chair. He felt something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not fear. He was too old for fear. It was something older than fear. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something large and not being able to see the bottom. He looked around the chamber at the other representatives, beings who were arguing, calculating, worried about trade routes and political implications, and what this meant for the balance of power on the frontier. None of them seemed to have noticed yet. The humans weren't just defending, they were hurting. When the administrator finally called on her directly, because it would have been a formal slight not to, she stood up. She looked around the room once slowly. Then she spoke. "We've heard the Vreth declaration," she said. Her voice was steady and clear. "We understand the situation. We'll handle it." She sat back down. The chamber was quiet again for a moment. Then it erupted, not in alarm, but in a kind of baffled murmuring. Representatives looked at each other. Some made sounds that translated roughly as laughter. Plune's eyes went a startled shade of pink. Sierval looked at Okonkwo for a long moment. She was already looking at something on her personal screen, no longer paying attention to the room around her. She did not look frightened. She did not look brave in the way that a being looks brave when they are pretending not to be scared. She looked like someone who had already decided what she was going to do and was now thinking about the details. Something about that bothered Searville in a way he could not immediately name. He filed the feeling away and said nothing. The administrator moved on. There were protocols to follow. The council would open an observation channel to monitor the conflict. This was standard practice for any war that took place within the borders of recognized council space. A team of analysts would track the movement of both fleets and provide regular updates to all representatives. Several species offered to mediate. The Vreth declined, as expected. The human delegation said they were not currently seeking mediation, which was a more interesting answer. Over the next 3 days, the Council's observation feed showed very little. The Vreth fleet assembled at the edge of human space, 1,400 ships in perfect formation, a sight that had ended wars just by appearing. It was one of the largest military assemblies the Council had recorded in 200 years. The analysts noted it with careful language, but the meaning was clear. This was not a border patrol. This was not a show of force. This was an end. On the human side, the feeds showed something strange. Ships were moving, but not toward the Vreth. They were moving away from the border colonies, moving deeper into human space, moving in directions that didn't seem to follow any obvious defensive pattern. One analyst suggested the humans were repositioning to defend their core systems. Another suggested they were panicking. A third said the movements didn't make tactical sense and the data might be incomplete. Searville watched the feeds each night before he slept and thought that all 3 analysts were probably wrong, but he couldn't yet say why. On the 4th day, the Vreth crossed the border. The Council opened a full live feed. Representatives gathered in smaller viewing groups across the station, some in the main chamber, some in private lounges, some watching from their personal quarters. Searville sat in the main chamber with 40 others, watching the large central screen. The Vreth fleet moved in perfect formation. 1,400 ships, not a single human vessel in sight to oppose them. Searville thought this would be over quickly. Ploon leaned over and said softly, "Where are the humans?" Searville shook his head slowly. "Retreating," he said. "They've pulled back. It's the right move, actually. They can't face that fleet in open space. They'll fall back and try to negotiate from a position of less total loss." He believed that. He had no reason not to. He would spend a long time afterward wondering how he had managed to be so completely wrong. The Vreth fleet pushed forward into human space, into a wide corridor of empty stars. No resistance, no contact, no humans anywhere on the sensors. Krethax, watching from his command ship, sent a message back to the Dominion. First systems will be secured within 48 hours. Humanity is already running. In the council chamber, a few representatives relaxed. Some began to discuss what the post-war settlement might look like. Someone brought up the question of what would happen to the human colonies after the Vreth took them. Okonkwo was not in the chamber. She had returned to her quarters shortly after the invasion began. The feed kept running. The Vreth kept moving. The stars around them were quiet and dark and still. And somewhere in that darkness, something was waiting. Krethax was not a fool, but he was angry. That was the dangerous combination, intelligence plus pride wounded badly enough to start making decisions that felt bold but were actually desperate. He had lost over half his fleet. He had been ambushed in a corridor, bled dry by invisible drones, and herded across human space like an animal being guided toward a gate. He knew he had been guided, not all at once, but in the last 30 minutes, as his admirals showed him the positioning data, he had seen the shape of it. The asteroid trap had closed the corridor. The drone strikes had disrupted his formation and pushed him left. The flanking human ships had blocked any retreat right. He had been moving, the whole time in one direction. He just didn't know, yet, what was waiting for him in that direction. His remaining fleet numbered somewhere between 600 and 700 ships, depending on how many of the dark, drifting vessels could be brought back online. His admirals had been attempting to restore power to the drone-struck ships, with mixed results. Some came back up. Many didn't. The junction failures had cascaded in different ways in different ships, and some vessels were simply too damaged to be recovered without a full repair dock. He had started this war with 1,400 warships. He was down to roughly half that number. He did the math. Even at half strength, he still outnumbered the human fleet if the intelligence reports were accurate. His ships were larger, better armored, equipped with heavier weapons. He had been hurt badly, but he was not finished. The Dominion had fought back from worse positions. The expansion wars had seen Vreth commanders reduced to a third of their starting strength and still win. What mattered now was not what he had lost. What mattered was what he still had. He gave the order to advance toward Saul. He told himself it was strategy. He told himself that pushing toward the human home system was the correct aggressive move. It would force the humans to commit everything they had to defending it, and he could fight them on his own terms. He had let them dictate the terms so far. It was time to change that. What he did not fully acknowledge, even to himself, was that he was also angry. That somewhere underneath the careful strategic thinking, there was a Vreth commander who had been made to look foolish in front of the Galactic Council, whose ships were drifting in pieces through space that was supposed to be easy territory, and who wanted very badly to hit something. The fleet moved. 660 ships in a compressed formation, not the wide wedge which had proved dangerous but a tighter grouping that was easier to protect. They moved at full speed. They crossed the distance toward Saul in a burning push, engines at maximum, weapons charged, shields at full power. They came out of the crossing at the boundary of the Saul system, and they found what had been waiting for them. 600 human warships. They were arranged not in a single line, but in a complex layered formation that the Vreth sensor officers had never seen before. Multiple overlapping groups, each positioned at a precise angle to the others, each covering the gaps in adjacent groups' fields of fire. Not a wall, not a wedge. Something that had no name in Vreth tactical doctrine because it had apparently been designed specifically for this moment, for this fleet size, for these exact ship positions. The human ships were also completely still. They had been waiting there, engines cold, weapons powered down, for at least an hour, according to the thermal readings the Vreth sensors pulled. They had been sitting in the dark, in silence, doing nothing, until the Vreth arrived. Krethax stared at the display. His jaw was tight. His amber eyes moved across the formation, taking in the ship classes, the positioning, the weapon signatures now powering up across 600 human vessels simultaneously. His sensor officers were feeding him numbers. The humans had full power, full ammunition. Their shields were coming up now fresh, uncharged, with maximum capacity. They had rested, refueled, and been sitting here waiting while his fleet had been fighting for 4 hours straight. He understood then what had been done to him. The whole campaign, the asteroid trap, the drones, the diplomatic stalling, it had been designed not just to destroy his fleet, but to exhaust it. To bring him here to this point, with ships that had been running at high power for hours, crews that were stressed and strained, commanders that were rattled. And across from him was a fleet that was fresh, calm, and had known exactly where this meeting would happen. He opened a channel to his senior admiral. "They planned this," he said. "All of it. This is where they wanted us." His senior admiral, to her credit, did not waste time arguing. "Options," she said. "We fight," Krethax said. "We have no other choice that doesn't end the Dominion's credibility in this galaxy permanently." He believed that. He also believed, somewhere quiet and honest in the back of his mind, that they were probably going to lose this engagement. But he was Krethax the Unyielding. He had a reputation older than some of the species watching this conflict from the council chamber. He could not be the grand commander who ran. He was about to give the advance order when the human flagship opened a channel. It was a large vessel, not the largest human ship in the formation, but built along sleek, powerful lines, painted a dark charcoal gray with a single long stripe of deep red running from bow to stern. Its designation was visible on the sensor feed, ESV Adamantine, and on the communications channel a voice came through. It was calm. It was clear. It was a human woman, and she spoke with the tone of someone reading from a very simple document. "This is Admiral Priya Vashistha, commanding officer of Earth's Solar Defense Fleet. You have entered protected Sol space. Your fleet has been fully tracked and your firing solutions have already been calculated for every vessel currently in range." A brief pause. "You have 30 seconds to signal surrender and hold your current position. After that, we finish this." Nothing else. No threats beyond that. No anger in the voice. No triumph, no gloating, no speech about human strength or Vreth failure. Just the statement, flat and honest, like someone telling you what the weather was going to be. 30 seconds. Director Yale Okonkwo walked back into the council chamber at the 4-hour and 38-minute mark. She came through the main entrance, alone, with the same quiet composure she had carried when she left. She wore the same plain gray uniform. She had the same expression, calm, attentive, slightly distracted, as if she was still working through something in her head. She sat back down in the human ambassador's seat, folded her hands on the desk, and looked at the main screen. The chamber was so quiet that her footsteps had been audible from the moment she entered. Every being in the room was watching her. She did not seem to notice, or if she did not feel the need to acknowledge it. She looked at the feed showing the wreckage of the Vreth fleet spread across the outer Sol system, the dark ships, the drifting debris, the 100 or so functional Vreth vessels sitting in held position, their weapons offline, their engines minimal, and her expression did not change. She had clearly already seen this. She had probably been watching the whole time from somewhere else. The administrator, whose role required him to maintain some functional order in the room, leaned toward his communications panel and formally announced that the human representative had returned and would be recognized to address the council. Okonkwo stood up. She looked around the room once, the same slow look she had given it before, 4.5 hours ago, when she had delivered 3 words and walked out. "The combat phase of this conflict is over," she said. "The Vreth fleet has been neutralized. All crew members on disabled vessels are alive and have been contacted via emergency channel. Their life support is functional, and our medical teams are preparing to offer assistance to any vessel that requests it." She paused to let that last part land. Some representatives shifted in their seats. "We are prepared to present terms," she continued. "The terms are as follows: full Vreth withdrawal from human space, beginning within 48 hours. Return of all colonial assets and records seized from outer reach administrative stations during the initial advance. A non-aggression treaty of 50 years duration, to be registered with this council and reviewed at the 40-year mark." She stopped. The room waited for the next part. The reparations, the territorial concessions, the demands for Vreth military reduction or resource payments or symbolic surrenders of some kind. These were the normal things. Every war ended with winners pressing the advantage, extracting whatever they could from the defeated party as compensation for the cost of the fight. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked, in every war Seerville had ever observed. Okonkwo sat back down. That was it, those were the terms. The silence lasted several seconds. Then the coordinator of the Yesin Alliance, the former military analyst who had stood up earlier, said, carefully, "Director Okonkwo, you've defeated the largest fleet assembled in this region of the galaxy in 200 years. In 5 hours. With those losses on the Vreth side, you could demand." "We know what we could demand," Okonkwo said. Her voice was not sharp, it was just clear. "Those are our terms." The coordinator sat down slowly. Another representative, one from the edge of the chamber, Delegate Thas of the Rinar Reaches, a quiet being who rarely spoke in open session, but was known to have one of the sharpest political minds in the council, said, "Is this a negotiating position, Director, or a final offer?" "It's a final offer," Okonkwo said. "There's nothing to negotiate. We fought this war to make the outer reach safe for our people, and the terms achieve that. There's nothing else we want." Thas studied her for a long moment. "Nothing else." Nothing else, Okonkwo confirmed. The chamber broke into noise again, but a different kind of noise than it had been making all day. Before, the arguing had been about what was happening, about what it meant for the balance of power, about which alliances might shift. Now it was something more confused, more unsettled, beings turning to each other and asking questions they didn't know how to form. Sirval did not join the noise. He sat in his chair and looked at Okonkwo, who had gone back to looking at something on her personal screen, and he thought about the choice she had just made, not as a diplomatic move, as a statement, because that was what it was. A statement that was louder than anything a victory speech could have said, louder than any demand, louder than the number of ships destroyed or the hours it had taken. They had won completely, and they had asked for only what they had asked for before the war started. Nothing more. At the 4-hour and 52-minute mark, Krethex accepted the terms. He sent the acceptance through the formal council channel, not through a personal communication to Okonkwo. He did not speak his acceptance. He transmitted it as a text document, properly formatted, signed with his command seal. Sirval thought that Krethex was probably not capable of speaking it out loud right now. He thought that was understandable. He thought, if he was honest, that he himself would have had a hard time saying it out loud. Then, after several minutes, after the acceptance had been registered and the council administrator had formally acknowledged it, the channel between the Adamantine and Krethex's flagship opened again, not through the council relay, directly. Krethex had opened it himself. There was a pause on the line. Then Krethex said, in a voice that was steady but had something underneath it, something that might have been the Vreth equivalent of a very deep breath, "How long have you been preparing for this?" The channel was being picked up by the council's monitoring system. Everyone in the chamber could hear it. There was a short pause on the human side. Then Admiral Vashistha's voice came through. "Since the moment we reached the stars," she said. Another pause, longer this time. Then Krethex closed the channel. Nobody in the council chamber said anything for almost a full minute after that. The feed was still running. The wreckage was still drifting. The Dark Vreth ships were still being catalogued by human recovery teams now moving through the area. But in the chamber itself, the noise had stopped entirely, and what was left was something very quiet and very still. Sirval picked up his personal data screen. He opened the council archive, the permanent record of classified intelligence assessments and species profiles, maintained and updated by the council's analytical division for 6,000 years. He found the human entry. He had read it before, years ago, and it had not seemed remarkable. A young species, aggressive in small ways, clever in limited contexts, not expected to be a significant military power for at least another century. He scrolled to the threat classification section. He looked at the last entry, which had been updated 18 months ago when the Vreth began pressing their territorial claim. The classification read, "Militarily naive, moderate threat potential, no immediate concern." He pressed edit. He crossed out the entire assessment. He thought for a moment about what to write instead. He thought about the asteroids, about the drones, about the diplomatic stalling and the pre-calculated firing solutions and the 4,000 simulations and the fleet that had been sitting cold and dark in the Sol system for an hour, waiting in perfect stillness. He thought about the terms, the restrained, precise, exact terms that asked for nothing that hadn't already been theirs. He thought about Okonkwo standing up in this chamber and saying 3 words. He typed slowly because he wanted to get it right. Do not provoke, do not underestimate, do not mistake patience for weakness. He paused, then he added one more line. This species has been watching the galaxy since it first looked up at the sky. Everything they have done suggests they have been getting ready for a very long time. They have not told anyone what they are ready for. They have not needed to. He saved the entry. He set the screen down. Around him, the chamber was starting to come back to life. Representatives were talking again, slowly, in low voices. Some of them were already thinking about what this meant for their own relations with humanity, whether alliances should be pursued, whether certain agreements should be revisited, whether there were things they had done or said over the years that humanity might have noted and remembered. Some were thinking about the Vreth and how the Dominion would recover from this. Some were just staring at the feed and processing. Sierville looked at the main screen one more time. The human fleet was still in formation around the outer Sol system. The adamantine sat at the center. From this angle, with the sun behind it, it was silhouetted against the light, a long, dark shape against the brightness, very still. Sierville thought about what the galaxy looked like on a star map. Thousands of systems, hundreds of species, ancient empires and young ones, powers that had burned brightly and collapsed, and quiet species on the edges of things who had never seemed very important until suddenly they were. Humanity was a small cluster of lights on that map, 11 systems, one home world, no ancient history by galactic standards, no inherited empires, no thousands of years of recorded warfare to their name. They had arrived late. They had been underestimated immediately and consistently by almost everyone who looked at them. And they had spent every year since they reached the stars getting ready. Not loudly, not with proclamations or military demonstrations or treaty negotiations that announced their capabilities. Quietly, carefully, the way you prepare for something when you understand that you may be alone in a very large and sometimes dangerous place, and that the only guarantee you have is the one you build yourself. Sierville was 312 years old. He had observed 22 interstellar wars. He had watched species rise and fall and disappear. He had seen every kind of military strategy and diplomatic maneuver the galaxy had to offer. He had never seen anything quite like what he had watched today. He stood up, which was not something he did often during sessions, and he walked slowly to the wide observation window at the side of the chamber, a long curved pane of transparent material that looked out at the star field beyond the station. He stood there for a while, just looking. The stars were the same as they always were, quiet, distant, indifferent, but the galaxy felt slightly different tonight than it had this morning. It felt like it had shifted in some small but permanent way, like a door that had been opened and could not be fully closed again. Humanity had shown something today, not just that they could win a war other species had won wars. They had shown what they chose to do with a victory. They had shown what they were actually after, and what they were after, as best as Sierville could read it, was not conquest, was not dominance, was not the building of an empire or the humbling of an enemy. What they were after was simply to be left alone, to be safe, to keep what was theirs and not have to do this again. And the method they had chosen for achieving that was not aggression. It was not intimidation. It was 30 years of quiet, unannounced, meticulous preparation. And then, when pushed into a corner, the calm and complete dismantling of the thing pushing them. It was, Sierville thought, the most efficient use of violence he had ever witnessed, not because of the ships destroyed or the hours it had taken, but because of what came after, because of those 3 terms. Asked for and nothing more, extended without anger, accepted without ceremony. You could fight humans. That had been proven now in the most complete possible way. They would not panic. They would not break. They would not fight back the way other species fought back, with fury and pride, but with something colder and more patient and far more dangerous than either. And at the end of it, they would hand you a document with 3 items on it and ask you to sign. Sierville looked at the stars for a long time. Then he turned and walked back to his seat and sat down and folded all 4 of his arms across his chest and thought quietly that the galaxy had probably always been this way, full of things that were waiting to be understood, and that the mistake most species made was assuming they had already understood everything that mattered. The timestamp on the main feed read, 5 hours and 0 minutes. The war was over. It always had been. In the council chamber, Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Sierval looked around at the faces of 30 beings who were watching the same feed he was watching, and he saw something he had never seen in 60 years of observing the galaxy's politics and wars. He saw an entire room hold its breath. Plune's eyes had gone completely transparent, a color Sierval had not seen from that species before, and assumed was reserved for moments beyond any normal emotional category. The 30 seconds passed. Krethax gave the advance order. What followed lasted 22 minutes. Sierval watched all of it. He watched the human fleet engage with a precision that went beyond training and into something else. Something that could only come from having run this exact scenario so many times in simulation that every crew member's hands knew what to do before their mind had finished processing the order. The humans did not fight with fury. They did not push forward recklessly. They worked in groups, cycling firing patterns to prevent shield overload, rotating ships between frontline engagement and protected positions, communicating in what the Council's intercept analysts later described as the most compressed, efficient tactical language they had ever recorded. Fewer words per action than any other species' military communication. Just enough information and nothing else. And they did not aim for the kill. That was the thing. The thing that stopped everyone in the council chamber who had been watching with professional detachment and made them lean forward, made them go quiet in a different way. The human ships fired with extraordinary precision, but they were not firing to destroy. They were firing to disable, targeting engines, not power cores, targeting weapon arrays, not bridge structures, targeting propulsion, not life support. Each shot was placed not to end a ship, but to end its ability to fight, while leaving the crew alive. 100 Vreth ships lost engine power in the first 4 minutes. 50 more lost weapons in the following 6. The rest of the Vreth fleet began to pull back, not by order, but by instinct, the natural movement of vessels whose crews were seeing what was happening to their companions, and processing the fact that this fight was not going the way any fight was supposed to go. By the time Krethax gave the order to halt, his fleet had been reduced to less than 100 functional warships. The rest were dark or drifting or running on minimum power. Behind him, the path back out of the Sol system was open. The humans had left it open, deliberately. He could leave if he wanted to. His remaining ships could survive. That was the final thing that broke through Krethax's composure. Not the losses, not the defeat. The fact that they had let him leave if he chose to. The fact that he had come here with 1,400 warships and the full weight of Vreth military history behind him, and the humans had taken him apart piece by piece over 4 hours and then left the door open. Like they weren't even worried about him walking out. In the council chamber, one representative, the coordinator of the Yesen Alliance, a being who had spent 40 years as a military analyst before entering politics, stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. She looked at the feed for a long moment. Then she turned to face the room. "I need someone to tell me," she said, "how many simulations you would have to run to achieve that level of targeting precision." The council analyst who answered had been running calculations for the past 20 minutes. His voice was slightly unsteady. At minimum, 4,000, possibly significantly more, and you would need perfect intelligence on Vreth ship specifications, Vreth formation doctrine, and Vreth commander behavioral profiles going back at least 15 years. And the targeting solutions were pre-calculated, the coordinator said. It was not a question. Vashistha said that at the start, firing solutions already calculated. Yes, the analyst said. They knew where every Vreth ship would be before they arrived. They had modeled the Vreth approach vector and predicted the formation with enough accuracy to have solutions ready. The coordinator looked at the room. They have been preparing for this, she said, for a very long time. Sierval thought about the document on his personal screen, the one with the 4% probability. He thought about how confident he had been, sitting in this chair, watching Okonkwo say 3 words and leave the room. He thought about all 22 wars he had seen, the patterns, the progressions, the inevitable outcomes, and how completely none of that had applied to what he had been watching for the past 4 hours. He thought about something one of his teachers had told him, back when he was very young, and the galaxy had seemed like a place with clear rules. The most dangerous thing in the universe, the old Thavian had said, is a species that has decided to survive. Not a species that is fighting to win. Not a species that is fighting for pride or resources or history. A species that has decided, quietly, calmly, and with complete seriousness, that it is going to survive, and has been working toward that end for longer than anyone watching them thought to ask about. Sierville had not thought about that lesson in a long time. He was thinking about it now,